Hello and welcome to Incorporating Sustainability through AIA's Sustainable Projects Exhibit, the E204-2017 webinar. This is a webinar brought to you by AIA Contract Documents. Thank you for joining us today. A few administrative items before we proceed to the presentation. This webinar is protected by U.S. and international copyright laws. So reproduction, distribution, display is not permitted without permission of the presenters. This program is also registered with the AIA for continuing education. Another disclaimer here, this webinar and all of the AIA contract documents education is not provided as legal advice. We always recommend that you consult with your attorney if applicable. Again, this is for educational purposes and not as legal advice. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to one of our presenters, Tracy, to introduce himself. Tracy, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Lee with SQ Dumez Ripple Architects in New Orleans, Louisiana. I am a member of the AIA Contract Documents Committee, a volunteer member, and have been with the committee for 5 years now. And co-presenting with me today is Wolf Saar, the current chairman of the committee.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. I live in Seattle, and as many of you know, either through experience or the news, we've been going through a lot of climate change that's resulting in wildfires in our region. And today I'm happy to report it's pouring rain outside and we're back to normal and we're breathing freely again. But the knowledge that buildings represent 50 to 75% of greenhouse gas emissions in cities really makes it critical for architects to practice design in a sustainable manner. So this is a particularly relevant presentation. As I mentioned, I live in Seattle. I'm the managing principal for VIA Architecture, a West Coast regional firm with offices in Seattle and Vancouver, British Columbia, and Oakland, California. And throughout my time on the Documents Committee, I've been involved on all the task groups developing the sustainable documents that we will discuss today. Tracy?
Here are our learning objectives. We're focusing today on sustainable design, as Wolf mentioned. And as Hosty said, this presentation qualifies for 1 hour of health, safety, and welfare credits under the AIA's program. Also, you should be able to self-report this if you're a lead AP to the GBCI for credit, for non-specialty credit there. We're focusing on sustainability, sustainable design, and in particular, some of the tools that AIA has developed, contractual tools to help architects and owners, contractors, engineers make their way through this process should they decide to collaborate on it. Just some background about the committee and the process before we begin the presentation. The Documents Committee, AIA Documents Committee, has been publishing documents for more than 130 years. The AIA created these standard legal forms to make design and construction transactions more predictable. And there are almost 200 forms and agreements in the program now, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with those. What makes the AIA documents the industry standard, besides market saturation, is the volume of case history and precedent that's incorporated into the documents. The publication cycle is 10 years, and with each revision to the documents, the most recent one was in 2017, the legal precedents that have happened in the AEC industry during the period before the publication are evaluated, and the committee and people involved look at the language to try to make sure that it's kept current and in accordance with best practices and developments that have happened since the previous publication. The documents have been drafted to represent each party's interest equally, and a lot of the contract language, and we'll be talking about this quite a bit today, this really boils down to allocating risk to the party that's best able to manage and control it. So attributing responsibility is really primarily what it's about. The process involves collecting and analyzing input from a lot of different sources. It's an iterative process. Drafts are developed and evaluated and vetted by various stakeholders, and then the final version is approved by the committee prior to publication. Who's involved in this? Well, there's a broad list of people here who's involved in the process. Each of these groups plays an important role in the development cycle. Early on, market research is done to validate that the things that we're concentrating on as a committee are important to the AEC industry. We work with industry stakeholders, other groups within the AIA, liaisons from other professional organizations, experts, legal subject matter experts. All these people are involved, and all of them volunteer their time. And the committee uses those resources to gather knowledge and feedback, and then the actual writing and editing and revising of the documents is done by the committee with assistance from legal people and other people on the full-time people on AIA staff. The committee itself is a diverse group of people, all architects, all volunteers, 30 to 35 people from all around the country, all different types of practitioners, large firms, small firms, single practitioners, residential people. Also includes architects who work as owners' representatives, architects who work for contractors, people who work in risk management, as well as some outside legal counsel provided by the AIA organization to kind of help as third-party eyes on this as we do it. Volunteers serve for 10 years, which is intended to coincide with the 10-year cycle that I mentioned about the vision of the documents. And that kind of in a nutshell is the process that the committee uses to develop the documents. I'll now pass it back over to Wolf to start the meat and bones of the presentation.
Thanks, Tracy. And for any of you out there that are keen on learning more about the Documents Committee and perhaps joining us, I invite you to reach out to the AIA with that interest. We're always looking for dedicated individuals to join us. So to set a strong foundation for today's presentation, I think we should start with understanding sustainability itself. Next slide. So what does sustainable mean? Solar panels on a roof of a one-story building are sustainable, but any building such as a hospital, high-rise office building, or a public facility can be sustainable. Features like water use and energy use can qualify the structure as sustainable. The building on the slide is a great example. It's the Bio-Innovation Center, and it's a high-performance medical science lab building in New Orleans designed by Tracy's firm. It's certified LEED Gold and was chosen as a Committee on the Environment Top 10 Award winner in 2015 by the AIA. Next slide. As noted on the slide, sustainable can mean a number of things to a number of people. Sustainable describes projects that incorporate design and construction practices that offer benefits to the environment, achieve energy savings, enhance the health and well-being of building occupants. You're probably all familiar with like the WELL building standard and such that have emerged in more recent years. Increasing building life cycle might be a motivator, increasing energy efficiency, and meeting the sustainable requirements of a code. For example, the International Green Building Code. So to some, LEED may not go far enough. To others, installing bike racks and a green roof may be all that's necessary to call a building sustainable. No matter how you define sustainable, the Sustainable Projects Exhibit and other Sustainable Projects documents have been designed to help meet the owner's goals. These documents can be used on a LEED project, a project where sustainable building elements are required by code, or where the owner simply wants to choose certain sustainable elements to meet its own needs or goals. The project on the screen here is the newest Sound Transit commuter rail station in the Seattle area. It's located south of Seattle-Tacoma Airport, and it was designed by my firm, VIA Architecture, in a design-build delivery method with PCL and HDR. In this case, the team adopted formal LEED certification for the station, which is the first train station in the United States to achieve LEED Gold. We used rooftop voltaic array designed to generate 7% of the station's annual power needs, rainwater harvesting that serves 100% of the station's planting irrigation needs. We also engaged an independent consultant, which we'll discuss a little bit later in this presentation. That was really advantageous because that independent consultant we found great value in the knowledge and the relationships with reviewers at the U.S. Green Building Council, and helped us address the nuances of the approval process. The design-build delivery method on this project lended itself well to performance expectations versus the design bid build project that is more common, or at least used to be more common. That more traditional design bid build process is more lower first cost driven, and the design build process allows us to really meet performance metrics. So to reinforce the challenges in clearly defining a sustainable building, the transit sector has provided some great opportunities for us to look beyond the building at funding, human resources, unionization, jurisdictions, and construction equipment as strategies to reduce environmental impact. In fact, in Portland, we were recently able to put in place the first system to capture energy from transit braking energy by brokering incentives with the energy utility that offset the costs of introducing that. We made the financial case to show a 1.6-year payback on a $250,000 investment. Obviously, as we break out of the box, we also need to be aware of the risks and address those. We will discuss this in more detail later in the presentation. Next slide. So what are some of the reasons that owners would want to have a sustainable building? A key reason is to achieve a certification rating. For example, LEED is a certification system that not only has different levels of certification like silver, gold, and platinum, but also different requirements based on project type: new construction, renovation, core and shell, and community design. LEED also considers multiple aspects of design and construction for the whole building, whereas other systems like Energy Star focuses exclusively on energy performance. Green Globes, which is near and dear to my heart because we've done a couple of multifamily buildings in Seattle that have achieved Green Globes certification, is a web-based program for green building guidance and certification. The program includes an on-site assessment by a third party, and ratings are represented as a quantity of globes, ranging from 1 to 4 globes, based on the percentage of points achieved. So we achieved on those buildings 3 globes, which is roughly equivalent to between silver and gold in the LEED certification system. Another reason owners may want a sustainable building is to benefit the environment through building design or performance metrics. These would be requirements established by the owner with the advice of the architect, such as decreased energy or water use, measures to increase occupant health and comfort, and incorporating other specific sustainable materials. Next slide. Many jurisdictions are developing their own standards for design and construction or adopting an existing certification system through regulations or codes. The codes listed on this slide are examples of some of the many codes under development or already required. Cal Green, for instance, is an example of a comprehensive code drafted by a jurisdiction. The DC Green Building Act is an example of the adoption of an existing certification system, in this case, LEED. The IGCC, the International Green Construction Code that I mentioned earlier, adds green provisions to existing codes, such as the IBC, or International Building Code. Some government owners may require sustainable design and construction independent of a code. The General Services Administration is an independent agency of the US government and the largest landowner in the US, and requires LEED Gold on all its projects. Next slide. So let's turn our attention to a historic legal case that involves sustainability. And this is the Chesapeake Bay case, which addresses the specification of green building products. Next slide. So the Philip Merrill Environmental Center was built in 2001 as the headquarters for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation is a nonprofit organization devoted to the restoration and protection of the Chesapeake Bay. It was founded in 1967. And some of the older people in the audience may recall that it was the first building to receive LEED Platinum certification. Clark was the general contractor, and the Smith Group was the architect. It featured a bunch of different sustainable measures. Platinum is a fairly audacious level to reach, and they featured composting toilets, rainwater retention and reuse, natural light, low energy use, geothermal wells for heating and cooling, and low VOC emitting materials, which is really the subject of what we're going to talk about next. Next slide. So I show this map because it's important to know where this is located. It's located right on the edge of the Chesapeake Bay near Annapolis, Maryland, which is a relatively harsh environment, and that does come into play in this case. Next. The design called for exposed structural wood members. Weyerhaeuser supplied the specified parallam columns and beams. Parallams are engineered wood products that use parallel wood strands bonded together with adhesive. Using such small strands allows more efficient use of wood products that might otherwise be wasted. All wood products are susceptible to moisture, but the use of small pieces glued together increases that risk, requiring selection of a moisture-resistant adhesive and protection, particularly in outdoor environments. Remember, the location on the bay makes this a particularly challenging environment to introduce this type of building into. Weyerhaeuser hired Permapost to apply a low-emitting preservative to the exterior wood members. It was called Polyclear 2000. Leaks were discovered in 2001 and 2002, and rot and deterioration were discovered in the late 2000s. So let's move to the dispute. The foundation, Clark, Smith, and Smith Group entered into a settlement to remove and replace all the exterior parallam beams. You can imagine what a nightmare that was. They filed suit against Weyerhaeuser for $9.6 million, and eventually Weyerhaeuser settled for $3.5 million and pursued Permapost in a separate action. There was no binding precedent due to the fact that this was a settlement, but we do have a court order on several motions that give us some clues as to the details of the dispute. Next. So what do we know? We know that no one got by unscathed. We know that Polyclear 2000 was unproven for this type of application. It wasn't even approved by the American Wood Protection Association. We know that all the experts agreed that, quote, a better approach would have been to use a different sealant, end quote. There were other choices that were better that would not meet the definition of sustainable that would have given a longer service life. And the last thing we know is that the court and expert witnesses didn't seem to care that Polyclear 2000 was a green, low-emitting, protective product. As to that last point, we don't know the contracts or the understanding between the parties with regard to the Polyclear 2000 product, but it seems that this product was selected primarily because it was green and LEED friendly. However, in the 20-plus page court opinion, which went into a good amount of detail about the product, almost nothing was said about it being a green product or that this was an overriding factor in it being selected. There are plenty of quotes from experts stating that this wasn't the best product to use, but nothing saying that the architect, owner, or contractor weighed the idea of an untested and imperfect product against the fact that it met green criteria, which was obviously important on this project. I may be reading too much into this, but as an architect, the lesson for me is that the owner may talk a lot about the importance of green design, but when it comes to litigation over a failed product, the arguments will all come down to whether the product performed. Not as compared to other green products, but compared to the entire market of products. There was no balancing of the product selection with the green goals of the project. Next slide. A couple of things that we do not know. Was it the selection of Polyclear 2000 or its improper application that caused the rot and deterioration? If Polyclear 2000 was applied perfectly, would the rot and deterioration still have occurred? If so, when? Did Weyerhaeuser hold itself out as possessing specialized knowledge regarding Polyclear 2000 and its application on the specified parallels? If so, could the architect rely on Weyerhaeuser's assurances? How does the architect weigh green qualities of products against performance of those products? That's really a key question. Next slide. Ultimately, as with everything, the key to successfully completing a sustainable project is communication among the parties. When addressing green products that do not have a proven performance history, the owner and architect need to communicate to properly understand the owner's goals and what can be done to meet those goals. And the owner also needs to understand how the selection of materials and equipment can affect how the project operates and the usability of the project. The contractor needs to understand what it is required to do and why certain elements have been selected. The AIA documents prescribe a process as follows. The architect informs the owner that A, the project may require materials and equipment that have had limited testing, and B, that the architect may not be able to confirm the manufacturer's representations. The next point is that the architect discusses possible effects with the owner. The owner then renders a written decision regarding use of such materials and equipment. The final point is that the architect is not responsible for failure of materials and equipment to perform according to manufacturer's representations. In reality, communication is important for all projects, but sustainable projects just reinforce this importance. Next slide. Let's turn now to the E204, the Sustainable Projects Exhibit. The E204 is an optional exhibit that accompanies AIA's design, bid, build, owner-architect, and owner-contractor agreements, such as the B101 owner-architect agreement or the A101 owner-contractor agreement. Those agreements contain a checkbox in the last article that lists the documents comprising the agreement, and users can select the E204 box if it applies. Next. So let's go into a little bit of the history. I mentioned, during my time on the committee, which is now over 10 years, I've been consistently involved in developing the sustainable documents. The evolution of sustainability in the AIA contract documents began with basic references and requirements for the architect to discuss environmentally responsible design approaches with the owner in some agreements, such as the B104-2017. In 2011, AIA released the D503 guide. This is a free guide which discussed legal and contractual issues associated with sustainable design and construction practices, and provided model language that could be incorporated into existing AIA documents. Then in 2012, AIA released the Sustainable Projects, or SP versions of key AIA contract documents, such as the B101 SP. The SP versions incorporated model language from the D503 into the traditional design bid build family of documents. By the end of 2013, AIA had released fully coordinated SP versions for each of the key contracts in the design bid build construction manager and the construction manager as constructor and construction manager as advisor families. That same year, the D503 guide was updated from a focus on suggesting model language to a detailed discussion of each new provision in the SP documents. As part of the 2014 Design Build Family Updates, AIA published its first standalone sustainability exhibit, the A141 2014 Exhibit C. With the 2017 documents release, AIA discontinued updates to individual SP agreements and moved those sustainability requirements into one document for the design bid build family, the E204-2017. And in 2019 did the same for the CMC and CMA families. Just this year, AIA released the D503-2020, the first update of the guide since 2013. The guide still comments on the roles and responsibilities of the owner, architect, and contractor, but in the context of E204. It also addresses a number of sustainability topics such as environmental product labels and certification systems, and also provides samples of completed sustainability plans. Next. The Sustainable Projects Exhibit contains a process by which the parties work to achieve the owner's sustainability goals, and also addresses the legal risks of the project by utilizing special definitions to define certain aspects of sustainable design and construction, provisions that allocate the roles, responsibilities, and risks encountered on sustainable projects to the project participant in the best position to perform or assume the role, responsibility, or risk. The E204 requires that the owner, architect, and contractor perform those sustainable measures allocated to the party in the sustainability plan, which Tracy's going to go into more detail on later in the presentation. A specialized scope of services for the architect and provisions about special issues relative to the owner, architect, and contractor is also included, and all these items will be discussed in greater detail later. Next. So, special definitions. The exhibit includes definitions that are necessary for this special set of project parameters. Let's go through these. Next slide. The sustainable objective is defined as the owner's goal of incorporating sustainable measures into the design or construction of the project to achieve a sustainability certification or other benefit to the environment, enhance the health and well-being of building occupants, or improve energy efficiency. The sustainable objective may or may not include seeking a specific type of certification. The B101, the 2017 version, the current version, has a fill point in the initial information for identification of the sustainable objective, if there is one. Next. A sustainable measure is a specific item that must be completed by each party in order to achieve the sustainable objective. Next. The sustainability plan is the document prepared by the architect showing the allocation of sustainable measures to each party. The owner, the architect, and contractor have responsibility for the sustainable measures allocated to each of them in the sustainability plan. And as mentioned, Tracy will go into greater depth on the sustainability plan later in the presentation. It's important to note that the sustainability plan is incorporated as a contract document. Next. Sustainability certification is the term that we use to refer to a specific certification, such as LEED or certification required by code. You see on the slide the 5 most common certification systems. We've talked about LEED. The Living Building Challenge, offered through the Living Future Institute, focuses on building renovations and new construction and is based entirely on building performance and requires that the building operate for 12 consecutive months prior to certification. The WELL certification system integrates scientific and medical research on environmental health, behavioral factors, and health outcomes. Passive House, the major components of that system are a super insulated envelope, ultra high performance windows, airtight construction, and elimination or reduction of thermal bridging, heat recovery, ventilation, and the use of minimal space conditioning systems. And finally, Green Globes, which I discussed earlier, and provides that globe certification by number of globes. Next. Sustainability documentation is defined as the documentation required by the owner or a certifying authority to document compliance or achievement of the sustainable measure. And finally, next slide, the certifying authority, that's the entity that is responsible for granting or denying a sustainability certification. This could be, for example, the Green Building Certification Institute, which is responsible for administrating LEED, or possibly a local jurisdiction. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Tracy, and he'll discuss the sustainability services. Tracy?
Thanks, Wolf. That's a great overview of the E204 document and some of the thinking and background that led up to it. And I hope you all are getting to the understanding that a lot of this is about just establishing responsibility for who does what when. But I want to drill down a little more deeply into specifically what's required, additional services that are required of the architect within the E204 as part of this process. And this is a listing of them. The sustainability workshop, which is intended to happen early in the process to kind of set the tone for what follows. The sustainability plan, which is probably the single most important element of all of this. And I'll talk a little more about those two pieces in depth. Continuing design services during schematic design, design development, construction documents phases to make sure that the project is being designed in a way that supports this sustainability plan and sustainable objective. Construction phase services, where the architect is responsible for administering the sustainability plan, much in the way he or she administers the general contract, and also reviewing proposed changes to make sure that they're in alignment with with the sustainable objective, substitutions, things like that, just to sort of evaluate those in the context of the sustainability plan and the sustainable objective. And then if there's a certification goal as a part of the sustainability plan, the architect, again, is the administrator of that and is responsible for doing the paperwork to get the project registered, whether it's LEED or Green Globes, any of the certification paths that have been discussed so far, gathering all the documentation, which if any of you have been the administrator for a LEED project, you know is a substantial task, registering the project, making sure that everything is submitted at the time that it needs to be throughout the course of the project. So that's kind of a synopsis of the architect services. The sustainability workshop, some people call it an eco-charrette, is intended to happen early in the process, and E204 prescribes that it happens before the end of the schematic design phase. This involves the owner's consultants, the architect's consultants, contractor, if there happens to be one, let's say in a design assist or CM situation, commissioning provider, if there's one on board at that stage. And the purpose of this is to confirm and establish the sustainable objective, to talk about potential sustainable measures to achieve it, understand and agree on how that affects the schedule, the owner's program, and of course the budget for the cost. In my experience, probably the single most important aspect of the sustainability workshop is making sure that the owner, our client, understands that they must take an active role in this process or it won't be successful. The result of the sustainability workshop is the plan. It contains these elements, and allocation of responsibility, again, is highlighted as something that's very important. And as Wolf mentioned, probably the most important takeaway about the sustainability plan is that it is a contract document. It is an attachment to the owner-contractor agreement, whether it's an A101, 102, or any of the other flagship documents. It is also can be an attachment to consultant agreements. There are instructions that require the contractor to convey the sustainability plan to its subcontractors. So this is a very important piece of the puzzle. We mentioned the updated D503 document, the Guide to Sustainable Projects. This is a free document downloadable from the AIA's website, aia.org. You don't need to be an AIA member to download it. It's about 60 pages. It has a lot of good information that amplifies on what we're discussing today. And among other things, it has several examples of sustainability plans as applicable to different situations. It's not exactly a full recipe, these examples. They're intended to provide a framework and a structure for one to use as one develops a sustainability plan. There is some suggested language to fill that I'll go through a little bit in this discussion today, but they're really not intended to be a template in the sense that one could just take it and apply it without any tailoring. Each project is different. Each sustainable objective is going to be slightly different, and so it's necessary to do some editing. But there is a framework there, and this kind of gives an overview of that. And I'll go through each of these pieces of it in a little more detail. An item number or a numbering system, just to keep track of things. A listing of the sustainable measures, just kind of a titling for reference. If there is some kind of certification path that is part of the sustainability plan, there's an opportunity here to include some analysis of that. allocation of responsibility, who's responsible for taking care of the requirement, and then a more thorough, deeper description of what each of the requirements, sustainable measures will be. This example that we're using here today comes from the D503 document, and it's tailored toward the LEED certification path. The item numbers are equivalent to what's on the LEED scorecard, if any of you have encountered that or done a LEED project. The sustainable measures are kind of a description that's straight out of the LEED certification instructions. The point or credit requirements will be familiar to you. They're the usual kind of yes, no, maybe allocations that one finds in the LEED scorecard. Responsible party is something that you won't find in the LEED scorecard, but we've stressed the importance of that here today. And then the description in this case can be as simple as just referring to the reference, the LEED reference guide, for a more involved description of what that particular sustainable measure is. Here's another example from the D503 that's patterned after the International Green Construction Code that was discussed earlier. It's very similar. The numbering system is mapped to the way that that document is numbered and organized. Sustainable measures are more or less copy pasted directly from the document just for continuity. In this case, there isn't really a point system, but there's a place to designate whether this particular aspect of the IGCC is applicable to the project, whether it's expected or whether it's maybe contingent on some other part of the sustainability plan or the code. Again, allocation of responsibility, primary and secondary, and then a description, which is a kind of an analysis of what the code requirement may be, in this case of the IGCC. So all of these things are contained in the Guide to Sustainable Projects, and if you plan to do a project like this and use the E204, I encourage you to consult that. It's a very useful document that was just recently updated, so it's very current. It's just a few months old now. So how does the E204 integrate with the B101 owner architect agreement, or 103? We'll talk a little bit about this. The B101-2007, so not the current version, but the preceding one, divided the architect services into the traditional basic services that we all know, and additional services. And then the additional services were further subdivided into two types, one that could be discussed and agreed on between the owner and the architect before commencement of the work, and the second one that happened as a course of construction due to unforeseen conditions or other things that arise during the construction phase. The 2017 edition of the B101 acknowledged that, but tried to make it a little clearer by introducing the concept of supplemental services. So now instead of two, we have three flavors of services: basic, supplemental, and additional. And the supplemental services really are just the same as the additional services previously that were that could be chosen from a menu and agreed on in advance of the execution of the contract. So, and that's found in the B101 and Article 4, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the table that is to be filled out in a B101. And it's set up so that if there are additional services chosen in the table, then there's a way to structure compensation for those separately. For instance, you might have a basic compensation that's based on a percentage of the cost of construction, but if you choose to do additional supplemental services such as sustainable design, you may want to negotiate a lump sum or some other method of compensation for that. And so in the B101 2017 Article 4, sustainability is identified as a supplemental service, and in particular, that document says that if this is something the owner and the architect agree to, then the E204 will be used as an exhibit and attachment to the owner-architect agreement to clarify and set forth the responsibilities and scope of work for everyone. And so, although we're focusing on the architect's responsibilities, it's also in the E204, it's spelled out what is required of the contractor and what is required of the owner in this. And then just to stress yet again, the sustainability plan and this whole process, including the E204, the way it's structured here, these are contract documents, so they're legal obligations of all the parties involved, the owner, architect, contractor, subcontractors, consultants, everyone involved in the process is legally bound to try to live up to these requirements and the scope that's assigned to them. A few things to kind of keep an eye on and make sure that you have a good understanding of going into a sustainable project. This is a list of a few things that we've identified that might need a little more attention than a usual project and may differ somewhat from the normal course of design services and construction as a result of the Sustainable Projects Exhibit. Substantial completion defined as the point at which a project can be occupied and used for its intended purpose. And the E204 makes it clear that especially if there's a certification requirement in the sustainability plan, this is something that the contractor may not have control over. And those of you who have done lead projects know that the certification sometimes happens a long time after the project is complete. So this attempts to make it clear through the language to owner and contractor that substantial completion isn't tied to the achievement of the sustainable objective. It isn't tied to lead certification if there's a lead path involved. Just to make sure that everyone understands that final payments and lien release can't be withheld just because the lead certification hasn't been awarded. But this sets up a situation where the owner may want a little protection because the contractor also has some responsibility for documentation in this. So there is the possibility of maybe owner considering having a performance bond in place, or perhaps negotiating language that extends the normal one-year correction period that's prescribed in the A101, just to make sure that everybody gets their part of it done. Final completion is a very similar situation, not strictly tied to the achievement of the sustainable objective, and the idea here is to make sure that the contractor gets their full payment when they've completed the amount of the work. And similarly, if there's something lingering out there that the contractor needs to do, then that needs to be anticipated and dealt with before it becomes an issue in a couple of ways that are listed here on the slide, perhaps a performance bond or the extension of the correction period, as I mentioned. Standard of care is something that all of us as architects, practicing architects, have become much more aware of in the last few years. There was in the 2007 versions of the AIA standard owner architect agreements, there was a definition inserted for standard of care. This did not change in the 2017 version significantly or really at all. But it's important to understand that the standard of care is really an evolving thing that can change from geographic location and jurisdiction to location and jurisdiction. It can change over time as new developments occur in the practice. And it's, I guess, the reason for bringing this up in the context of the E204 and sustainable projects is that as the AIA and the profession begins to take on more responsibility about elements of sustainable design, there's a feeling that that the standard of care may be expanding to the point that that's generally accepted practice rather than something that's exceptional. So just a caution to keep that in mind as part of your practice. Related to the discussion about substantial completion, final completion, is the notion that the contractor especially, but also the architect, is not guaranteeing or warrantying that that the project will achieve the sustainable objective. There are too many unknowns and possibilities for pitfalls to give some kind of a guarantee that might be binding or might not be insurable. So this is something to bring up with your owners, if your clients, if you enter into this type of agreement, to just make sure that they understand the implications of that. The next piece that's discussed here is related, I think, to the case study that Wolf presented earlier, and some of the discussion that he gave about that sometimes achieving a very aggressive sustainability goal or objective may require the design professionals or the contractor to get out on a limb a bit. And it's just critical to understand before that happens, before anything becomes potentially an issue, that we're all in this together and the owner makes the ultimate decision about whether to pursue something that may be untested or unknown, such as in the Chesapeake Bay Foundation case. An example of how the case law and precedent has guided the AIA and the documents committee to structure the language of the documents. Something else to take note of, especially with LEED, but certainly with living building and some of the other certification paths, the registration costs can be rather expensive, thousands of dollars, in some cases tens of thousands of dollars. So this language in the E204 just makes it clear to owner and architect that this is the case, and that if it's intended to be a reimbursable expense to the architect, then there's the possibility of collecting an initial payment to offset that from the beginning, so that the architect doesn't have to fund it. Consequential damages. In the base B101-103 documents, there's a waiver of consequential damages, and by that I mean things that are typically unforeseen or secondary that might come out of a delay by the contractor, a delay by the owner, that might cause some kind of financial damage that's not directly attributable to negligence by any of the parties, but is a real number anyway, but very difficult to prove, and has been the result over the years of a lot of claims and disputes. And so the AIA in its template documents has suggested and taken the position that there should be a waiver of consequential damages. Many times in my experience, owners don't want to agree to that and take it out and negotiate it out. So this gives another opportunity to negotiate a specific waiver having to do with some of the unknowns of the sustainability concept that we have been talking about today. So this just kind of gives a second chance, even if it's waived as an overall part of the agreement. This gives an opportunity to deal with consequential damages that are specifically related to the unknowns and vagaries of sustainable design. And then substitutions, I think, is something that has been the source of the failure of a number of projects that had very aggressive and commendable sustainability goals. So this just makes it clear from the onset that that can happen, that the contractor or owner may suggest a substitution without really fully understanding the implications of it, and the architect is the person who really should be the one to make that call as to whether it really is helping meet the sustainable goals. And there's another part of this, which is that you can't put it all back on the contractor. The contractor may not have the background or the knowledge of why something was chosen or what its place is in the program, the overall program of sustainability plan. So the language of the E204 gives the contractor the right to ask for some kind of explanation or support or assistance from the architect in making a decision about a specification, a substitution. So that kind of wraps up that part of the discussion about some of the particular things that architects should be aware of in entering into this kind of agreement. And I'll now pass it over to Wolf to talk a little bit about some things that are slightly outside the boundaries of what we have been discussing here today.
Thanks, Tracy. So just for the last few minutes of the presentation, let's focus briefly on the sustainable documents for construction management and design build. The E204 does not apply to CM projects. However, the AIA also offers a sustainable projects exhibit for construction management and for design build project deliveries. Both address the considerations we've already discussed and also address the CM's unique role in pre-design services. Next slide. In the case where the construction manager is also the constructor, the AIA has developed the E234, which came out last year. Early involvement of the CMC, who is also the constructor of the project, can prove a valuable asset when selecting the sustainable objective and the sustainable measures that will be applicable to the project. The CMC can begin ordering long lead items and may also have experience using certain new products developed for sustainable projects. The construction manager will have direct responsibility for performing certain sustainable measures outlined in the sustainability plan. Next. In the situation where the construction manager is an advisor, the E235 is designed to address sustainability. In a CMA delivery model, the construction manager has a close cooperation with the owner and the architect during the pre-construction phase and maintains additional responsibilities during construction. As a result, the CMA documents offer a unique opportunity for the CM to assist in developing and implementing a sustainable design and construction program. During pre-construction, the CMA can review the sustainability plan and offer advice on constructability, materials availability, the time requirements for procurement, life cycle data, and analyze any cost and schedule impacts. And during construction, the CMA will coordinate the multiple prime contractors and the performance of the sustainable measures, collect the sustainability documentation from the multiple prime contractors, and respond to the architect regarding requests for information from the certifying authorities. Next slide. In design build, and this didn't exist when we did that project here in Seattle for the Angle Lake transit station, but exists now. It's like the design bid build and CM documents. The design build family has its own sustainable projects exhibit. In this case, the A141-2014 Exhibit C. That exhibit also mirrors the content and organization of E204 and contains the same requirements of conducting a sustainability workshop, after which the design builder prepares a sustainability plan. The advantage of this is that allocating responsibility for certification credits or other sustainable measures can be confirmed with the responsible party early in the design. Exhibit C is meant to be incorporated at the owner design builder level and then flows down to the architect and the contractor. This way, all parties are operating under the same set of terms regulating the sustainable project. So this concludes our presentation. I'm going to turn it back over to Hasti for some closing remarks.
Excellent presentation, Wolf and Tracy. We thank you for the time you took to put it together. For all of our attendees, we have the contact and resources appearing on your screen. But any questions we can't get to today, please send to docinfo@aia.org. That's where you can send any content-related questions. Anything we can't answer today will be answered there. And with that, I'd like to again thank our presenters for this thoughtful presentation, and I'd like to thank our attendees for taking the time to join us. We hope you found this webinar helpful.
Thank you, everyone.